Editor, KDKA TV, CBS Pittsburgh. And our special guest is Timothy DeFore, who is the Republican candidate for State Auditor General. Mr. DeFore, thank you, sir. Always good to be with you.
And as always, it's a pleasure to be with you as well. And I've said this before, it's always a pleasure to talk to people who live in a place that I used to call home.
Well, we're going to ask you about that. But first, Tim, I know you are the county controller in Dauphin County.
That's correct.
Help us to understand a little bit about your background. Where'd you grow up? Where are you from? And tell us about that Pittsburgh connection.
Okay. Well, as far as where I grew up here in Harrisburg, Susquehanna Township, which is just north of the city. If you've been to the farm show, just maybe a mile north of the farm show. As far as my background, it's pretty consistent with auditing and investigating fraud, waste, and abuse in state government. I was with the State Inspector General's office, where I investigated government fraud, waste, and abuse. And from there, I was then recruited by the Attorney General's office, where I investigated Medicaid, Medicare, insurance fraud, and also prescription drug diversion. And I spent some more time back out in Pittsburgh. I was with UPMC Health Plan, where I helped build their fraud and abuse department. And also I was a federal contractor, where one of my responsibilities was to audit the auditors, if you can imagine that. And what I did there was, if you are a contractor with the federal government, particularly with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, if you were contracting with them, then you had to have certain qualifications and certain credentials in order to contract with them. That included your employees. So if there was a contract, then it was my responsibility to make sure that these companies who were contracting with the federal government, that their employees met the qualifications in which the job description entailed, which means I would have, I'm sorry.
No, I finished your thought. I apologize. I didn't mean to.
That's okay, which meant that I was the one responsible for assuring that these individuals met had the proper credentials, had a proper experience, and that these contractors just weren't hiring somebody off the street just to get a contract with the federal government. So, but as far as my Pittsburgh ties, I received my bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh, along with my younger brother, who's also a University of Pittsburgh alumnus, my older brother, who is also a University of Pittsburgh alumnus and is a former track star at the University of Pittsburgh. So my family, we love the Steel City,
Well, good. That's a lot of connections. If you're a Pitt family, that's great.
Absolutely.
So at some point you got into the political world by running for county controller and winning, not once, but I believe you're in your second term.
Yes, I am.
So what led you to run for State Auditor General?
I felt an obligation, a moral obligation to a Commonwealth that has treated me so well, and protecting our tax dollars, your tax dollars, my tax dollars, your viewers' tax dollars. I come from a family of coal miners, auto workers, and steel workers from Beckley, West Virginia, and Northern Ohio. And these are blue-collar, dues-paying union members. And for years, from the time that I was a child, I would constantly hear about them talking about how the federal government and government period, what they were doing with their tax dollars. And even as a child, I didn't quite understand it, but that's something that stuck with me. And it ultimately led to my career choices. And this is something that I chose. And because I think it's very important that government be held accountable with regards to how our tax dollars are being spent. And it all started back when I was a child.
Do you see yourself as more qualified to hold this office than your Democratic opponent?
Well, I'll tell you what I will say is that I think I'm uniquely qualified. And here's why I'm uniquely qualified. For 30 years, I've been consistent with regards to what I've done. And that is to identify fraud, waste, and abuse and how government spends our tax dollars. And I believe that that makes me uniquely qualified. And I've been consistent with regards to doing that. And so so it's in that sense, I feel that that I am qualified to do the position. And I mean, from day one, the moment hopefully I am elected, and from day one, the only thing that I would need in order to get to work, and I've said this before, is the password to my computer. Because if you look at my bio and you look at my skill set, it's been very consistent with one word: audit and auditing. And the position that I'm running for is Auditor General.
Your opponent believes that this position can be used as a public policy advocacy, that she would be an advocate on a variety of public policy issues. Do you see that as the role of the Auditor General?
Well, you can be an advocate. However, your first responsibility is to the Pennsylvania Fiscal Code. The Pennsylvania Fiscal Code states what the Auditor General shall do. It doesn't say Republicans do this. It doesn't say Democrats do that. It states what the Auditor General shall do. So that is your first order of business, is to follow the Pennsylvania Fiscal Code. Now, you can be an advocate, but that isn't one of the core responsibilities of the Auditor General's office. And what my plan is to follow the fiscal code, follow the letter of the law of the fiscal code, the same way that I currently do with the Pennsylvania County Code.
You know, when you look at polls, Mr. DeFore, across Pennsylvania, the ones that I've seen suggest that this race for Auditor General is a bit of a toss-up, because neither one of you, to be honest, at this stage, is a very well-known person across the Commonwealth. I think you'd acknowledge that. Do you think that this race is dependent on the presidential race? That is, if President Trump wins the state, the Republican candidate wins as Auditor General. If Vice President Biden wins the state, the Democratic candidate wins as Auditor General. How do you?
It's definitely going to be one of the contributing factors, and I'd be naive not to necessarily believe that. But the interesting thing that's going to happen this year, this is going to be the first general election where there's no straight party voting, and that is the wild card in all this. So with that being said, that throws another mix into all this, and so that's going to make things rather interesting. But to answer your question, yeah, I think that the presidential, the top of the ticket, ultimately it filters down to the rest of the people running for office, especially in the statewide office.
Do you think it matters if the Auditor General is in the opposite party of the governor of the Commonwealth?
It really shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't. Now, it can be dangerous if you align yourself too much with the governor or anybody in state position. That's why one of the things that I've tried to do is in some areas is to remain neutral, because your job is to do one job, and that is make sure that the fiscal integrity of taxpaying dollars are in fact intact. So you have to be very, very careful with regards to what you do and who you may align yourself with politically.
Finally, Mr. DeFore, both you and your opponent, you're making history here, because you're both people of color. And, some people will say it's about time that we see this in Pennsylvania. Do you think this makes a difference at all in this election?
Well, first of all, I consider myself African American. And the reason why I consider myself African American is because I want to, because of the struggles of the African American people, my family, my relatives, the people that have paved the way for me to even talk to you and run for this office. So I've always considered myself African American first and foremost. But to answer your question, I think it's great that here we are. We have both myself and the other candidate that are currently in this position, and people aren't necessarily looking at the color of one's skins, but hopefully what they're looking at is the experience that comes with it. Because with everything that's going on today, and I've said this time and time again, experience matters in this position. This is a position where that requires a subject matter expert, especially with regards to what we're getting into pertaining to the COVID funding and pertaining to the economy. And it's going to take a subject matter expert in auditing to help get us out of this.
Well, Timothy,
I think I'm not a subject matter expert.
Yeah. Well, Timothy DeFore, the Republican candidate for State Auditor General and the current County Controller in Dauphin County. Thank you, sir, very much. I enjoyed talking to you today. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me. It's been good.
Our special guest is Nina Ahmad, who is the Democratic candidate for State Auditor General. Ms. Ahmad, always, or maybe Dr. Ahmad, always good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Always good to see you, John.
So, Nina, let me just ask you to give us that 60-second elevator speech. Who is Nina Ahmad?
Hello, everyone. My name is Nina Ahmad, and I'm the Democratic nominee for Auditor General for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I am a scientist who has served as a public servant, as a deputy mayor in Philadelphia. I have served in many civic capacities, as well as our President Obama, where I served on his Commission for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I've served as an advocate. I continue to be an advocate to make sure we level the playing field for everyone, particularly women and marginalized communities. I come to this office to not only make sure your tax dollars are used with integrity, but with maximum transparency and accountability, because that will allow us to see how equitably those dollars are distributed. I want to not only make sure there's no fraud and abuse, but I also want to see how efficiently and effectively your tax dollars are used and how we are making sure that every Pennsylvanian is seen and served.
You know, I had a chance to talk to your opponent, who basically is not critical of you. He's careful not to go negative, but he certainly says that, look, he says, I'm an auditor. I'm a county controller. I've been doing this job. I don't need any training to do this job. And thereby suggesting that he's far more qualified to be State Auditor General than you. What's your response to that argument?
So my response is, this is a leadership job at the core of the issue. This is the job that actually manages people like him, auditors and CPAs and investigators. And it is about giving direction. It is about understanding the role and making sure we're acting efficiently and effectively, and is also redesigning some of the focus of this office to make sure our audits, actually the design of the audits, are not only capturing essential data, but are done in a way that we can use that as actionable information that we will serve with our legislators, that we will serve with our executive branch. This is much broader than having a narrow view of this office. This is a strategic position of being part of the vision of what Pennsylvania can be. So that's my answer to people who say, you don't have this narrow band of experience, because what you bring is a lived experience that makes sure you leave no one behind. That is critical as a public servant, that we have that, I believe, have that lens as we look at every dollar, where it's going and who it's serving.
We have discussed this before, of course, because I think your view of the office as one of our 3 statewide row offices is that there's an opportunity to be a public policy leader in that office. Am I stating that right?
Yes, it's actually an office that works in concert with those who actually make policy, right? So if they're making policy without actually understanding the outcome of how the dollars were used, that is the feedback loop, particularly to the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, to make sure they see the budget that they had laid out. What did it actually do? What were the outcomes? What do they need to tweak? Do they need to put more money here or there? If we don't have that kind of feedback, where are they going to get it? This is the office that collects information about every dollar that goes out. And so it is our I think a mission should, at least it's going to be in my mission statement, that we work closely with the public, with the executive branch and the legislative branch to make sure that whatever public policies are going out are informed by data and, very importantly, are implemented. We have, for example, Act 102 on the books that says that nurses cannot be forced to do overtime. It's a public safety issue, but hospitals routinely do that. I would be working with the Department of Labor to look at those audits of how our Medicaid dollars are going and how many nurses are being employed. How is the overtime for that? Are they trying to do the two jobs with one person? Those are the things we can have real input on.
And I'm assuming that you would not be shy in suggesting what those policies ought to be that the legislature or the executive should adopt.
Don't get me into trouble now, John. No, we will not be shy, but we also won't be talking out of turn and making sure I have relationships with people. People understand what I am bringing to the table. That's why looking at broad bipartisan issues like healthcare, where our prescription drugs cost so much, that's been a standard issue I've talked about on the campaign trail. Education is another one. We want every Pennsylvanian to be ready to compete on the global market. And of course, having jobs in order to be educated to get the jobs of the new millennium, right? So I think when you talk to your legislators and the executive branch and you find intersecting common issues, I think you can work collaboratively, and I think you can really move the needle forward.
How would you assess the 8-year term of Eugene D. Pasquale, who has been Auditor General? He's done a lot of audits. He's been very public on issues. Is that a bit of a role model, or will you do things differently?
Yeah, I will build on that legacy. I think he has shined the light on places that needed it. And I want to now make that data that he got as actionable as possible. I will also look to broaden some of the scopes and maybe narrow some of the other scopes, but I have to get in and to see the nitty-gritty of exactly what each of those reports said and what happened to those reports? What happened to those recommendations after the audit was done? I want to actually do a measure of recommendations made on this date, delivered here, and what is the outcome on the movement of those recommendations, and then report back to the public. This is what I've done with your tax dollars in this office.
So let me turn now to the campaign, because this has got to be very challenging during the COVID environment.
Yeah.
How are you campaigning? How are you getting out there? Is it doable?
So mostly doing it on this platform, using Zoom, but we have been cautiously going out, mask. I actually wear gloves. We're going out in places which are mostly open or have enough room and headroom actually, so that the circulation is good. So we have when the weather was better, now it's getting a little cooler. We actually, went out to Indiana County by the riverside and had a lovely event. Went to other places in Northeast Pennsylvania. So we are getting around in a limited manner. I was in Erie, Pennsylvania, where we did an outdoor a march to the ballot box. It was a rally, women's rally, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the vote and the fact that not everybody got the vote, and then actually walked to the ballot box. It was all open air, beautiful, great reception. So we've been around. We're traveling again to Western Pennsylvania soon to a big labor rally. So there's a lot of ground troops who are supporting me to get the word out. So you mentioned earlier on the top of our conversation, what is your visibility? Their visibility in places that you and I don't even see. I had 500,000 calls made for me by a statewide organization that endorsed me. So we have this level of engagement. It's huge.
Let me ask you before I move to my last question. So this is sort of second to the last. A lot of people will say about this race, you're overshadowed for sure by the presidential election. Is it your view, Nina, that how the state goes on the presidential level dictates who wins this office? For example, if Joe Biden sweeps Pennsylvania, you're going to be the next Auditor General. if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, Tim DeFore will be the next Auditor
I
General.
mean,
Do you buy that?
there's some of that. I think for some voters, you know, we don't have straight ticket voting anymore in the poll, you know, at the voting booth. But when you're doing a mail-in ballot, there's no straight ticket voting anyways. So that's an advantage for them to assess as they go down the ticket, they go down the ballot for each position. I just believe Democrats are overwhelmingly going to be voting a straight Democratic ticket. I do well with independents, and I have a little bit of Republicans looking at me. I think people are just assessing. This is a sort of a nonpartisan job once you win it, because you're serving, it's an executive office, you serve everyone. You really look at someone, what kind of broad experience are they bringing to the table that I will be able to assess whether it's a community in urban county or it's a community that has no high-speed broadband in a rural county. So that level of awareness of having a broad perspective is what I think is very useful for this job. And I think people will, if they've done their homework, I think they'll vote for me, regardless of who they're voting on the top of the ticket.
And final question, Nina Ahmad, if, well, you're a Bangladeshi native, came to Pennsylvania many years ago, and of course are a full citizen. You are the first woman of color running for this kind of statewide row officer, and your opponent is also a person of color, an African American.
That's right.
So one way or the other, either one of you is going to make a little bit of history.
That's right.
Here. What does it mean? Does it mean anything at all, having people of color run for this office in Pennsylvania? Some of us would say it took a long time, but at least we're here now. What does it mean?
I think it means a lot because of what you yourself have experienced as a person of color and the lens you bring. For example, I don't think there's ever been an Auditor General who has spoken about maternal mortality and the fact that all women are dying more than they used to 25 years ago, which is not a good reflection on our healthcare. But Black women are dying 3 times more than white women. And we need to get to the bottom of it. And all the data shows it's just implicit bias baked into our institutions, right? So how we unpack that and match that to the dollars is something that I want to look at. Again, outcomes come into play. I don't think there has been anyone who has spoken about this issue and wouldn't have unless this is something that I have worked on already and written about and advocated for. And so when you bring that kind of lens, and that comes because I'm a person of color, right? When I talk about what are the barriers to making sure you're getting the services, COVID-19 was a perfect example. People who got tested, who had access to testing. Right in Philadelphia, we had a young doctor, Dr. Ayla Stanford, who took it upon herself. She's a pediatric surgeon. She took a band of doctors together, went from church parking lot to parking lot, testing people. Because if our federal government had done that and done it in these communities, we would have contained this infection. And she saw a need, she did it. Now, as a public official, we should know this, right? We should know where services are happening or are being received or not, and why, and unpacking that, because they pay taxes just as much. In fact, we have a regressive tax system. They pay more than their fair share. So I think it becomes very important that you bring that lens of equity to the table to see how your tax dollars are being used.
Well, Nina Ahmad, the Democratic candidate for State Auditor General, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day. And I'll see you in Pittsburgh next week.
We sure hope so.